Good afternoon, students. Today is Thursday, 10 February 2022. This is our second lecture of the week and the second of three lectures on the essay by Stephen Wise on farm animals. Now, before we get started on the material, let me make a few preliminary points. First of all, our exam is 1 week from today. I've been telling you all along. The exam is on the 17th of February, which is 1 week from today. And on that day, obviously, you will not be coming to the classroom. You will be going into Canvas starting at 8 in the morning, and you'll have 80 minutes to take the exam, 1 hour and 20 minutes. That's the same amount of time you would have if I were to give the exam in the classroom. Okay, so the exam goes from 8 o'clock sharp until 9:20. You can take as much of that 80 minutes as you need or want. I do recommend that you, if you finish before 80 minutes, go back and examine your answers. You may discover that you made a blunder, and it could save you some points. So that's 1 week from today. For a few days now, I've had posted a document I call a sampling of examination questions. Now, I promised that I would put it up by today, but actually I posted it a few days ago. And what you should do is look it over carefully. First of all, it'll give you an idea of the kind of questions that you can expect to see on my exam or exams. And secondly, some of those questions, maybe many of them, maybe even all of them, could show up on the exam a week from today. So if you at least remember the answers to those questions, you would in effect be getting free points. So I encourage you to make use of that. Now, I sent an email around yesterday. I was somewhat shocked to learn yesterday morning that I tested positive for COVID. I have no symptoms, maybe a nagging cough. You've seen me cough when I'm doing my lectures, but that doesn't bother me. I've had allergies for many years, and I cough from time to time because of that. So I wouldn't even know from my cough that I had COVID. But my body temperature is normal and has been for many days. I have no other symptoms, so it's strange that I tested positive. Now, because I'm positive, I have to quarantine for at least 14 days, according to the instructions I was given by UTA. So why don't we had originally planned to be live in the classroom on the 1st of March. Now we have 2 reasons to hold off on going into the classroom until the 1st of March. So that's my plan. My plan is on the 1st of March, which is a Tuesday, I will be back in the classroom at 8 o'clock in the morning, twice a week. There will be no more videos recorded and posted, so you will need to come to class starting on the 1st of March. And if you can't make it to class, you will need to get lecture notes from someone who was there. So when you do come to class, you should make friends with somebody, possibly exchange emails. And then if you miss a class, if one of you misses a class, you can ask your study partner, your friend, for notes. Now keep in mind that I'm going to continue posting my own lecture notes for the whole course. I've done so for all 3 readings to this point, Orrin Kerr, Lon Fuller, and Stephen Wise. So you have my lecture notes. If you want to get a student's lecture notes in addition for any day you miss after the 1st of March, then feel free to do so. Now there are a number of items posted. Many of them say optional reading, and that means it's up to you whether you read those items. I encourage you to do so. That's why I posted them. But if you choose not to, that's okay as well. And I won't test you on any of those optional items. Okay, so that takes care of the postings. Let's get to our topic for today. This is day 2 of our discussion of Stephen Wise's essay, which came out in 1986. And I have my copy here in case I want to read a little bit from it. So by now, I assume you've read the whole article. with or without the footnotes. And I assume you have that article in front of you and that you have my lecture notes in front of you. So let's get started. I'm about to begin the section entitled Inadequacies of Present Law. Now, Stephen Wise is a lawyer, as you know, and he knows the law pretty well. He knows the law regarding animals pretty well. And he observes that the law as it currently stands, or at least as of 1986, because things may have changed somewhat since then, although not in a way that Wise would be happy with. Wise wants more change than has occurred in the past 3 decades or so. He's impatient. I guess you could say he's impatient. He thinks that change should have arrived long ago, and it should arrive soon if justice is to be done to farm animals. So let's take a look at some of the background that Wise discusses. That's his section heading, by the way, his subsection heading. He says on page 197 that there are, quote, 3 fundamental, sometimes contradictory mistakes in our thought about animals. So what are these mistakes? What false beliefs do human beings have about animals? False beliefs that, if corrected, might change people's attitude toward the law and might make people more motivated to change the law for the sake of animals. So here's the first mistake. And I'm going to quote, for each mistake, I'm going to quote Wise and then discuss it with you. And I might add at the outset that I wish Wise had elaborated some of these points. He spends only a few sentences on each of them, and I wish he had said more. That would have made the article longer, and it's already long. But sometimes you need to unpack things and make sure your readers understand. So I'm going to fill in what I think are the details for each of these. Okay, number 1, page 197, Wise says that we assume that non-human animals possess insufficient mind. We make that assumption. We assume that animals either lack minds altogether, or if they have minds at all, their minds are insufficient or inadequate. They don't match up to our own human minds. And many people think that because animals have inadequate or insufficient minds, that somehow they count for less, morally speaking. They're lacking something that is necessary for them to have moral status or even moral rights. Now, let me give you a little bit of a background on this. There have been people, including some very, very smart people, who have thought that animals don't have minds at all. René Descartes, and you can see his name in my lecture notes on page 3, René Descartes is one of the greatest philosophers and scientists of all time. He lived between 1596 and 1650. He was a Frenchman. Descartes held the view, and I know it will sound crazy when I say it, Descartes appears to have believed, in all sincerity, that no animals have minds. No animals are even conscious. They have no consciousness. Now, how could he believe such a thing? Well, he believed in God, and he believed that God made animals as well as everything else that exists. And God made animals God made animals appear to be conscious. He made them appear to be in pain from time to time. And so if you were to kick a dog, the dog would yelp, run away, maybe limp, whimper. All of those behavioral signs, according to Descartes, do not indicate that the dog is in pain. Descartes believed that dogs are incapable of experiencing pain. They're incapable of suffering. They're not sentient beings. So if you believe that they are, you're simply mistaken, according to Descartes. Animals are what Descartes called bête machines. That's a French term. It means beast machines. Descartes thought that animals were simply very sophisticated robots created by God to serve human purposes. Now, not many people today believe what Descartes believed about animals. Almost everyone today believes that animals are at least conscious, and some may even be self conscious. They may have consciousness of themselves as distinct from others. So, very few people are as skeptical about animal minds as Descartes was. In fact, if you look at the reply made to Descartes by one of his contemporaries, a man named Voltaire, a very famous writer, Voltaire wrote the following, and I'm going to look at page 202 of the article. Voltaire is reported to have said the following: "You discover in him, an animal, all the same organs of feeling as in yourself. Answer me, mechanist," and that's a term he's applying to Descartes. "Answer me, mechanist, has nature arranged all the springs of feeling in this animal to the end that he may not feel?" Unquote. Now that's a rhetorical question. Voltaire thinks the answer is that animals do have minds, they are capable of suffering, they do feel pain as well as pleasure. And what he's saying there is that animals, if you study their physiology, their anatomy, you'll discover that animals have a brain just as humans do. They have a central nervous system just as humans do. They have nerve endings throughout their body just as humans do. They react in ways that are similar to the ways humans react when humans are in pain. So if I were to kick a child, the child would probably let out a yelp and whimper and try to get away. Well, that's exactly what a dog or any other animal would do. And isn't that at least prima facie evidence that the animal feels pain just as we humans do? So Voltaire is pointing out that animals are very much like humans in several relevant ways, such as having a brain. And therefore, we can infer that animals have the capacity to feel pain just as humans do. In fact, what is the evolutionary value of pain? The evolutionary value of pain is that once you start to experience pain, you will try to get away from whatever it is that's causing it. And that has obviously evolutionary value. If you're able to get away from painful stimuli, you're liable to survive longer and reproduce. And the reproduction will pass on your pain-avoiding genes to your offspring. So from an evolutionary point of view, pain makes perfect sense. And animals, just as humans, can reproduce. It stands to reason that the pain response is an evolutionary adaptation in animals, just as it is in humans. Now plants who are stuck in the ground can't get away from painful stimuli. So that gives us reason to think that plants do not feel pain. What good would it do to a plant to have a pain response? It can't get away from painful stimuli the way an animal can. And so in all likelihood, plants do not feel pain. They are not sentient. Trees, bushes, grass, and other plants. So the real divide is not between humans and other animals. The real divide is between all animals on the one hand and plants and inanimate objects on the other hand. Humans and animals are sentient, S-E-N-T-I-E-N-T. They are capable of suffering or of experiencing pleasure and pain. But plants and rocks and other inanimate objects are not sentient. And that makes a difference morally, because pain, most people say, is intrinsically bad. The mere fact that a being is in pain is a bad state of affairs, morally speaking. And by the same token, you might say that the mere fact that a being is experiencing pleasure is a good state, a good thing, intrinsically good. So pain and pleasure are respectively good, bad and good. And so if a particular animal is experiencing pain, that's bad. Morally speaking, that's bad. It would be a better world if that animal were not experiencing that pain. And that's as true for an animal as it is for a human. Um, Plants are different. They cannot experience pleasure or pain. So if animals have moral status at all, it has to be based on something besides sentience. You see that? So I think all of this is in Wise's mind. He simply didn't elaborate on it. He does point out, by the way, that according to Charles Darwin, the originator or one of the originators of the theory of natural selection, sometimes called evolution, Charles Darwin studied animals very carefully, and his conclusion was that the difference between humans and animals is not all or nothing. It's not a clear, distinct boundary. Animals, like humans, have emotions. He wrote a whole book on it, on that topic. The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal, I think is the title of that book. So Darwin's view is that humans and animals differ not in kind, but in degree. The difference between a human and an animal is a difference of degree. Humans may have more of something that animals have less of. Humans have minds that are more sophisticated than animal minds. Humans are capable of doing mathematics and logic. Presumably no animal can do such things. But that doesn't mean animals can't do any reasoning at all. It doesn't mean that animals' minds are non-existent or even that they're very primitive. Some animals have very sophisticated minds. Chimpanzees, bonobos, porpoises, and so on. Other animals at the lower end of the spectrum may have more primitive minds, snakes or other reptiles, amphibians. And it may be with regard to certain animals like insects that we simply don't know whether they're sentient, right? So an animal could be clearly sentient, it could be clearly non-sentient, like an amoeba or a bacterium, or it may be doubtful. It may be somewhere in the middle where we simply don't know. We don't have good evidence either way as to whether that organism can experience pain. And one more thing, Wise points out in this section, although he doesn't elaborate on it, he points out that some people in the past viewed slaves as having less intelligence than non-slaves. In other words, their minds were not as developed or not as sophisticated. And many people took that as a justification of slavery. If the people being enslaved have lesser minds than those who are enslaving them, then perhaps that can be justified. Maybe slavery, according to this way of thinking, is morally acceptable. Now, Wise doesn't believe that, and I'm sure you don't, and I don't. We now view that as a piece of sophistry, flimsy reasoning, fallacious reasoning. We now know that the people who were enslaved had minds that were just as sophisticated as the minds of those who were enslaving them. In fact, it looks like it was a rationalization. Those who enslaved others wanted to find some justification for it. And what they latched onto was this mental aspect. They told themselves, they persuaded themselves that the people they were enslaving were lesser beings, that they weren't fully human, that their minds were not sophisticated enough or elaborate enough or developed enough. So you can see where Wise is going with this. Wise thinks that our treatment of animals today mimics the treatment of slaves in past times, past eras. And Wise is hopeful that one day people will come to see that we were terribly unjust to animals in the ways we treated them, the way we used them. We did not take their pain and suffering into account when we made decisions about how to treat them. So, Wise is in danger of offending people when he compares our treatment of animals to the treatment of slaves, but he really, I think, believes that in terms of the amount of suffering inflicted, the amount of deprivation, that our treatment of animals is very significant, very unjust, just as slavery was unjust and would be today if it were practiced anywhere today. Okay, there's another person looming over us as we discuss this, and it's Immanuel Kant, the Prussian philosopher who lived in the 18th century between 1724 and 1804. Kant, like Descartes, is one of the greatest philosophers of all time, a genius, a brilliant man. And yet he held the view that animals, while they do have consciousness, they do have minds. In that he disagreed with Descartes. Kant thought that animals lacked something else that is necessary for moral status. And that missing thing is rationality. Humans, and only humans, are rational beings, according to Kant. We're capable of reasoning, solving problems. Animals are not. For Kant, animals are non-rational. And Kant happened to think that that is the crucial difference. Morally, it makes all the difference. Anything with rationality matters morally, and we must treat it respectfully. Anything that is not rational may be used for our purposes. Anything non-rational is a mere thing. Now, I may have mentioned this the other day. I recall doing so. Kant held the view that while animals themselves do not have rights morally, they do not matter morally, we should still be kind to them rather than cruel. And I think I explained why, but I'll give you a quick quick review. Kant thought that if we're kind to animals, it will cultivate kindness in ourselves. And then in our dealings with humans, we're more likely to be kind to them rather than cruel. And we are required morally to be kind to humans. So animals are good practice, according to Kant. We practice on them, and that helps develop a certain kind of character in us that we then apply to humans. This, by the way, is called the indirect duty view. And there may well be a question or two on the exam, so let me say a few words about it. The direct duty view says that we have direct duties to other beings. And according to Kant, every human, every responsible human, every adult has duties directly to other humans. But Kant's view was that we have no direct duties to any animals, and that's because they have no moral status of their own. But we do have indirect duties to animals, Kant said. So, for example, suppose you have a dog. That dog is your companion. We can even think of you as owning the dog. We can think of the dog as your property. Kant would say that everyone has a duty not to harm your dog, not because they have duties to your dog, because they don't, but because they have duties to you. You're a human being. So I have a duty to you not to harm your dog. It's the same as the duty I have to you not to harm your car. Your car is your property. I cannot break the windows of your car without your permission. Why? Because you own that car. You have an interest in that car remaining intact. And unless I have permission from you to break a window, I am wronging you by breaking your car's window. You see how that works? Kant viewed animals the way this car is being viewed. They are our property. We have property rights in them. We have interest in them, in their well-being. And if they are harmed without our permission, then we are the ones who are being wronged, not the animal. Once again, that's called the indirect duty view, and it was held by people like Immanuel Kant. Other people hold it as well. Many people, maybe you hold this view, I don't know. Okay, so that's the first mistake, according to Wise, the first mistake people make. It has to do with animal minds. Many people think that animals have no minds at all, like Descartes. Well, maybe not many people, but some people may believe that animals have no minds at all. Other people, probably far more, believe that animals, while they have minds, have insufficient minds or inadequate minds or rudimentary, undeveloped minds. And for that reason, we don't need to treat them morally the way we treat humans. All right, let's turn now to the second mistake, according to Wise. I'm going to quote from page 198 where he discusses it. He says, quote, "We overly credit animals with the ability to engage in moral thinking." Have you ever heard someone say, maybe you've thought this thought yourself, animals, or at least certain animals, kill and eat other animals. Therefore, since we humans are animals, we may morally kill and eat other animals if we want to, if we enjoy eating their flesh. Once again, animals kill and eat each other. We are animals. Why are we not entitled to kill and eat animals as well? In fact, the story is that Benjamin Franklin, and you know him from your study of American history, a wise man who was considered one of the founders of our constitutional republic. Ben Franklin tells a story in his autobiography, and I'll just give you the gist of it. Franklin said that as a young man, he chose to abstain from meat, or he would become what we call a vegetarian. And then at one point, having been a vegetarian for some time, he says, in fact, I have the actual quotation from Ben Franklin. I tracked it down. Let me find it very quickly and read it to you in Ben Franklin's own words. Okay, here it is. It's one paragraph long. This is from Franklin's autobiography. Listen to this. Ben wrote, quote, "I believe I have omitted mentioning that in my first voyage from Boston, being becalmed off Block Island, our people set about catching cod and hauled up a great many." That's a fish, cod. "Hitherto, I had stuck to my resolution of not eating animal food. And on this occasion, I considered, with my master Tryon, the taking every fish as a kind of unprovoked murder, since none of them had or ever could do us any injury that might justify the slaughter. All this seemed very reasonable, but I had formerly been a great lover of fish, and when this came hot out of the frying pan, it smelt admirably well. I balanced some time between principle and inclination till I recollected that when the fish were opened, or gutted, I saw smaller fish taken out of their stomachs. Then thought I, if you eat one another, I don't see why we mayn't eat you. So I dined upon cod very heartily, and continued to eat with other people, returning only now and then occasionally to a vegetable diet. So convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do." Now, he's being wry there at the end, isn't he? He's saying, thank goodness I'm a reasonable creature with the ability to reason, because if you're a reasoning creature, you can find a reason for doing anything you want to do for other reasons. So he's admitting that this was not a principled position that he was taking. He simply missed the taste of fish. He enjoyed eating it before he became a vegetarian. And on this occasion, he went back to eating fish. He was overcome by the inclination or desire to eat fish, and his moral scruples His moral principles were thrown out the window. So what is Ben Franklin, what is he saying in effect? He's saying fish eat other fish, so why can't we humans eat them? Now, Wise thinks this is a grave error because there's a morally relevant difference between humans and all other animals. And that difference has to do with what's called moral agency. Human beings are moral agents, at least most of us. We have the capacity to make moral decisions, to reason about moral matters, and then act upon them. Because we are moral agents, we are morally responsible for our actions and inactions. We're morally responsible not only for what we do, but for what we choose not to do. But no animal is a moral agent. None. No animal, therefore, can be held morally accountable or morally responsible for what it does. So, excuse me, humans are moral agents, most of them at any rate. No animals are moral agents. So it makes no sense to blame an animal for what it does. An animal is simply acting out its instinctual urges. Animals don't stop and think before they prey upon other animals. They don't even ask themselves, is it morally permissible for me to kill that rabbit and eat it? No coyote would pause for a moment to think it through. In fact, the coyote doesn't have the capacity to reason about it, to think about it, to act on principle. But most humans are. Now, I should explain why I keep saying most humans. You and I are moral agents. We're mature. We're grown up. Children, at least very small children, are not yet moral agents. And that's why we don't hold them responsible for what they do. As children grow and develop, they become more and more capable of making moral judgments and reasoning, and we begin to hold them responsible for what they do. A 14-year-old child, for example, will probably be held accountable by his or her parents for things that child does. And by the time people reach the age of 18 or 25, certainly, they're fully moral agents, and we hold them responsible not only in the law, but morally for what they do. You can no longer defend yourself by saying, I'm just a child, right? I'm only 22. I'm barely old enough to drink or to vote in the law, so I'm not responsible. No court would accept that as a defense. And I also have in mind not just children, but people who have various intellectual limitations. The term, it used to be called retardation. Now people mostly call it intellectual disability. So people with intellectual disabilities may not be moral agents. They're not, therefore, responsible for what they do or omit to do. So most human beings, most of the time, are morally responsible. They are moral agents, and animals are not. Okay, let's use that distinction now, that concept of moral agency, to explore this. Wouldn't it be foolish to reason as follows? Like Ben Franklin did? Fish eat other fish, therefore it's morally permissible for we humans to eat them. Well, the relevant difference is the fish who eats the other fish is not a moral agent and is not, therefore, morally responsible for what it does. It's acting on its instincts. It's just following its genetic program. We humans, of course, are different. We can think about it and decide whether we may eat other animals. It's a matter of reasoning. It's a matter of rationality. Some people, wise probably, have chosen not to consume animal flesh. They've chosen vegetarianism as a way of life. And they've chosen it because they think it's required by morality, by moral principles or moral rules that they accept. So it's always fallacious to infer that because an animal does something, it's permissible for us, we humans, to do it. That's simply a mistake. It's an error in reasoning. It's a fallacy. And by the way, not all animals do eat other animals. Many animals are herbivores. Cows, for example, don't eat other animals the way wolves do. Cows eat a plant-based diet. Another problem with this way of thinking is that it's cherry picking. If we are to emulate animals, why do we pick and choose which types of act we follow or emulate and which we don't? If we're going to follow animal dietary practices, why shouldn't we follow animal child raising practices? I'm using the word child for lack of a better term. Animals raise their offspring in a certain way. Should we humans emulate them? Should we raise our offspring the way animals do? Of course not. So humans conveniently choose to follow animals when it suits their convenience, but not when it doesn't suit their convenience. And that's called cherry picking. If we're going to follow animals, we should follow all of their behavior, not just the types of behavior that we like for other reasons. Now, if you look at my page 4, at the top of my lecture notes on page 4, what's the opposite of a moral agent? Well, an agent is someone who acts, right? An agent in the law and in everyday life. A patient is someone who is acted upon, who is capable of being harmed by moral agents. So we have two concepts, moral agents and moral patients. Some beings are moral agents and some are not. Some beings are moral patients and some are not. And this diagram shows you 4 combinations. A particular being could be both a moral agent and a moral patient. And that would be the northwest quadrant of my diagram. Do you see that? Notice on the left of my diagram, in the leftmost column, I have X is a moral agent, and down below I say X is not a moral agent. So every being, everything is either a moral agent or it's not. And if you look at the top of this diagram, it says X is a moral patient, and on the right of it says X is not a moral patient. So every being, every entity is either a moral patient or it's not. And by constructing this diagram, I have taken this distinction together with the one across the top, and I've created 4 cells. Let me call them the northwest quadrant or cell, the northeast, the southwest, and the southeast. And what I did, just to show you how this works, is I filled in what appear to be actual examples of each of these categories, or at least 3 of the 4. So here we go. Look at the northwest quadrant, the one in the upper left on my diagram. I'm looking for beings who are both moral agents and moral patients. They can not only act in a way that they're morally responsible for, but they can be acted upon by other moral agents. They can be harmed or wronged or mistreated. Right? Something matters to them. That's what makes them a moral patient. Now, who falls into this category? Most humans do. You do. I do. You and I now are both moral agents who are responsible for our behavior and moral patients who can be harmed and wronged by other moral agents. No animals are in this category, right? That doesn't mean they're not moral patients, because they are, some are. It's because no animals are moral agents. Remember, the northwest quadrant is filled with beings who are both moral agents and moral patients. If no animals are moral agents, then no animals go into this cell. And that's why I wrote most humans, no animals. Why did I say most humans? Well, it's because, as I said earlier, not all humans are moral agents. Young children are not, although they may well become moral agents. Um, People with severe cognitive limitations or disabilities, people who are mentally ill, and that sort of thing. So they're human beings, but they're not moral agents. Okay, look at the southwest quadrant. This is the class of beings who are moral patients in the sense that they can be harmed by others, uh, harmed by moral agents, but they're not themselves moral agents. And here's what I wrote in there. Some humans, children, the severely retarded or cognitively, intellectually disabled, the insane or mentally ill, and the senile, people who are very old and whose minds are no longer functioning adequately, people with Alzheimer's disease, or at least late stage Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. So some humans go into that category. They're, excuse me, they're moral patients because they're sentient, they can suffer, they can be harmed, they can be wronged, but they're not moral agents. They're not yet moral agents in the case of children, or they're no longer moral agents in the case of the aged and senile. But notice what else I put in this cell, the southwest quadrant. Most animals go in this cell. Dogs, cats, cows, pigs, chickens. And I listed them because those are the animals most often, well, not dogs and cats, but cows, pigs, and chickens are the animals most often eaten, probably. Dogs and cats are the animals most often befriended or taken in as companions. So this is where they go. Animals like this, they're all moral patients because they're all sentient. They therefore can all suffer. They have an interest in not suffering. They can be wronged when they're made to suffer without justification. They can be harmed by being made to suffer. But none of them is a moral agent. Okay, let's go to the southeast quadrant, the one on the lower right. These are beings who are neither moral agents nor moral patients. I call them beings. We can think of them as things or entities. I'm trying to find the most generic term. Some humans, sadly, go in this category, and they're called human vegetables. You've probably heard that term. They're vegetative, they're in vegetative states, but they're humans, they're human beings. They're in irreversible comas, for example. Those are called vegetative states. And because they're in irreversible comas, they are not moral agents. They're not responsible for their behavior. In fact, they're incapable of acting at all. They're not moral patients either. And that's because their minds are no longer functioning. They cannot feel pain any longer because of the coma. They cannot suffer. They are not even conscious. They have no minds any longer. So human vegetables, human beings who are in irreversible comas or vegetative states, are neither moral agents nor moral patients. Now, I'm not suggesting that we may do anything we please with them. I'm simply categorizing them. What exactly are the limitations on what we may do to them? That needs to be argued for. I'm simply categorizing them right now. I'm not making any judgments about what we may or may not do to them. But notice what else I put in this cell. Some animals go in this cell. Insects, for example, worms, oysters probably. They are not moral agents any more than dogs or cats are, but they're not moral patients either, and that's because they're not sentient. At least we have no good reason for thinking that they're sentient beings. They can't suffer. So there's nothing you can do to wrong them or harm them. What else goes in this category? Minerals, rocks, dirt, inanimate objects in general, artifacts, things made by human beings. I'm going to reach over, well, let me show you my computer mouse. See it? That's an inanimate object. It's made by humans, yes, but it's not animated. It's not an animal, human or non-human. So that's where that goes. This computer mouse, not a real mouse, but a computer mouse, goes in the southeast quadrant. It's clearly not a moral agent. It's not a moral patient either. There's nothing I can do to this computer mouse that matters to it. Notice, if this were a real mouse, a living organism, it would not go in the southeast quadrant. Where would it go? It would go in the southwest quadrant. A real mouse, as opposed to this computer mouse, is sentient. And so while it's not a moral agent, it is a moral patient. So it would go in with dogs, cats, pigs, cows, chickens, also mice, rats. All right. Now there's one cell unaccounted for. It's the northeast quadrant. I put a special symbol in there. It's a circle with a slash through it, and it simply means the null set. I can't think of any beings who go in here. In fact, can you think of any? It would have to be a being that is a moral agent, but not a moral patient. Well, try to imagine a being that's a moral agent. It's capable of acting, capable of reasoning, capable of acting on principle. How could there be a being like that who is not capable of being wronged or harmed by other moral agents? It seems like it's an impossibility. So I put a null set symbol in there because I can't think of any beings who go in that category. Okay, I hope that clarifies these concepts for you. I'm mentioning all this not because Wise goes deeply into it, but because he does talk in this part of the article about moral agents. And his claim seems to be that animals, while they're conscious, sentient, while they have interests, and while they may even be beings with rights, moral or legal rights, they are not moral agents. And that's why we don't hold them responsible for their conduct. By the way, I wanted to point out, and you can see on page 4 of my lecture notes, during the Middle Ages, the medieval period, which went on for several hundred years, and this may surprise you to learn this, but certain animals were not only put on trial for various crimes they had allegedly committed, but some of them were convicted of those crimes and sentenced to be punished, and actually punished. There are articles and even whole books written about this. In one case that I remember, a pig, and keep in mind that pigs sometimes lived in the same house as the humans. Maybe they were kept in a certain part of the house, away from the humans. And they would be kept in the house not only to keep them out of the elements, the very cold weather or very hot weather, but also to keep them from being killed by wild animals or stolen by other humans. So pigs were kept within the same enclosure, the same structure. And in one case, a pig got out of its part of the house and gored a child, an infant, and I think maybe killed the child. The pig was thought to have done this on purpose. The pig was thought to be responsible, and that called for punishment. So the pig was put on trial. An attorney was appointed by the court to represent the pig, and it would have been interesting to see what argument was made, that the pig didn't mean to do it or was acting under an impulse or something like that. Anyway, the attorney was appointed to represent the pig's interest, and the pig was eventually sentenced to death and put to death. Some of these animals who were sentenced to death were hanged, some were burned, and some of them were quartered, drawn and quartered, horrific punishments. So What that shows you is that during the medieval period, there must have been people who thought that animals were moral agents and that they were therefore responsible for their conduct. Okay, I also put in my notes on page 4 just to make sure you understand the terms. A carnivore, what's the difference between a carnivore, a herbivore, an omnivore? Or is it herbivore? I think we call them herbs, so I guess it's herbivore. Carnivore, herbivore, omnivore. Well, vor, V-O-R-E, means devour. It comes from the Latin word vorare, which means devour or eat. Our word voracious comes from that. So people say, I have a voracious appetite, meaning I have a strong desire to eat something. I'm very hungry. So a carn is meat, flesh. So a carnivore is a flesh eater, either exclusively or primarily. I've heard people say humans are carnivores, and that of course is mistaken. Humans are not carnivores. We're capable of eating flesh or meat, but we've not evolved to eat that exclusively or even primarily. There may be people who eat solely meat or primarily meat, but most human beings eat a vast quantity of plant foods as well as or instead of meat. So what do we call beings who eat exclusively or primarily plants? They're herbivores, herb meaning plants. And what's the name for beings who eat both flesh and plant-based foods? They're called omnivores. Omni means all. Human beings are, unless you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you are, I assume, an omnivore. You eat flesh from time to time, various animals, and also plants of various types. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the third mistake that people make, according to Stephen Wise. He says on page 199, animals are viewed as incompletely evolved beings, lower than we are on an evolutionary ladder, unquote. So the idea is that many people view evolution as a hierarchy. The most evolved beings are at the top, and usually humans are put up there. We're highly evolved, more than any other animal species. And then you have beings who are a little bit lower than we are, primates, I suppose. And then further down the scale, at the very bottom, you would have very rudimentary beings, very low on the evolutionary scale. Bacteria, viruses, and a little bit higher up, worms, insects, mollusks, clams and oysters, things like that. So many people view evolution as some kind of a hierarchy from high to low. And the mistake, according to Wise, the mistake is thinking that the higher you are on this evolutionary scale, the greater the moral status that you have. The idea is that there is a certain kind of progress, moral progress, as you move up the scale or the hierarchy. So the beings at the top are the pinnacle of evolution. They have the highest moral status. They've progressed the farthest. And those at the bottom are at the low end of the scale. This is sometimes called the great chain of being, with humans at the top and insects way toward the bottom. Now, Wise thinks this is a mistake. Animals are not less evolved beings. Animals, he says, are complete unto themselves. A dog or a hawk, let's take a hawk or an eagle, a bird. These animals are highly evolved. They have capacities that no human has. They have near perfect vision. I've heard it said that a hawk or an eagle can view the slightest movement on the ground from a mile in the air. Think about that. You're a mile above the ground and you can see with your eyes the tiniest movement of a mouse or a mole. and then the birds swoop down, and once they observe it visually, they get into position to capture it and eat it. So birds like eagles and hawks have vision far superior to the vision of any human. I've also heard it said in a reputable book that the dog sense of smell, get this, is 1 million times superior to the sense of smell of a human. 1 million times. Dogs have an incredible ability to smell that we humans can barely even imagine. Dogs can be trained to smell drugs like cocaine, which is why drugs are used in law enforcement. Bloodhounds can follow a trail that's days old, where someone simply walked through the woods. I've been out with my dogs in a meadow where there are rabbits and squirrels and so on. And one time I was with my dogs. This has actually happened more than once. I'm out walking my dogs, and they're off the leash because it's an open area away from people. And I can see that there's a rabbit no more than 30 feet from the dogs. The dogs, instead of looking up and seeing the rabbit, the dogs are busy smelling the track of where the rabbit was maybe an hour ago. So I laugh when this happens because the dog is on the trail of the rabbit. And if the dog had long enough, the dog would eventually get to where the rabbit now is. Right? But that's going to take some time. If the dog would simply look up and use the dog's eyes, the dog would see the rabbit instead of following this old trail. And in thinking about that, I came to the conclusion that dogs live in the past. Literally. The dog's sense of smell is so powerful that the dog is smelling what occurred maybe a day or more ago, the past. So because of the dog's heightened sense of smell, dogs have a whole different orientation to the world, and specifically to time and space. Now, other animals have tremendous hearing. Rabbits, for example, with their big ears, can hear faint noises far in the distance. Antelope, out west, have tremendous sense of hearing, far superior to human hearing. So we think we're perfectly developed. We think our senses are acute, but other animal species have senses that surpass ours. So we shouldn't think of animals as lesser than us. They may be lesser than us in certain respects, but they're superior to us in other respects. Each species of animal is perfectly adapted to its niche, to its world, a world very different from ours, a world with predators, for example. So the mistake we make is thinking that there's some correlation between biological or evolved hierarchy and moral status. Just because we have certain capacities that put us above other animals, like rationality, doesn't mean that morally we are entitled to do what we please with them. If that were the case, then other animals, such as eagles, would be allowed to do what they please with us, since their vision is superior. Now, that's actually nonsense because eagles are not moral agents. It's not as though we would blame them, but if they were moral agents, then they would be, by this logic, entitled to harm us because their vision is superior to ours. Okay, so I think that's what Wise is talking about in this section. In all three of these cases, all three of these mistakes, I wish he had elaborated. And so I'm trying to guess at what he's trying to say and then fill out the details. For the third one, as I have in my notes, just the gist of it is this: evolution does not equal progress. Those are two different concepts. Evolution is factual. Progress is moral, right? So those two scales do not correlate with one another. Evolution is not the same as progress. Okay, let's continue. Let's see, we're an hour into our lecture. I don't want to go too long, so give me another 10, perhaps 15 minutes, and we'll stop. And we have one more full day on whys, so I just need to make sure we're able to finish in that third day. Okay, let's talk a little bit about rights. There's a difference between legal rights and moral rights. Legal rights are rights that are conferred by legislators, for example, or by judges. They're rights under the law. Moral rights are different. Moral rights are independent of any particular legal system. Have you ever heard of a human right? The concept of a human right? There are people who think that human beings, simply by virtue of being humans, have certain rights. And these rights are possessed by humans not because any government created them and conferred them on humans. In fact, we have these rights against governments. If a particular government is torturing and imprisoning its citizens simply for speaking out against the government, we would say that that person's human rights are being infringed or violated. There are rights, according to this view, against your own government. So it would be wrong to think that these rights come from government. Okay? In fact, if you read the Declaration of Independence, it begins, not right at the beginning, but I think the second part goes like this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I have that memorized. I memorized it long ago, and I simply haven't forgotten it. But those are stirring words written by Thomas Jefferson and signed onto by the other 54 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Notice what Jefferson is saying there. He's saying that we have certain rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that every human has these rights equally, and that these rights come not from government, but from the Creator. Right? We're endowed with certain unalienable rights that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unalienable means that you have it, not because you earned it, not because it was given to you. You have it simply by virtue of your status as a human being. Right? And also, unalienable means these rights can't be lost, taken away, or even given away. These rights are inherent in you. They're stuck to you, and you can't. They've always been stuck to you. No one gave them to you, and they always will be stuck to you. They can't be taken away. Those are stirring words and stirring ideas, aren't they? Now, did Jefferson live up to the words? He said all men are created equal. Well, Jefferson, we now know, we've always known, owned other human beings as property. He may have treated his slaves better than others did at the time, but he did own slaves. They had no legal status. They were mere things in the eyes of the law. So we can condemn Jefferson. He may have been no worse than others of his time and place, but he was a very intelligent man, and he was certainly capable of viewing things differently, of seeing the humanity in these enslaved people and taking steps to free them. I think Jefferson did stipulate in his will that upon his death, all of his slaves be freed. So you have to put that on the scale when you're evaluating Jefferson the man. Other people did the same sort of thing. They didn't give up their slaves during their lives, but upon their death, they saw to it that their slaves would be freed, that their legal status would be changed. So back to the point. I was distinguishing legal rights from moral rights. Now, Stephen Wise is very clear. If you look at page 203, here's what he says about farm animals. He says, quote, "Farm animals presently have no legal rights," unquote. Now, that's a strong claim. No legal rights. The law treats farm animals as though they were things, like pieces of wood or metal. A farm animal has the same status in the law as a tractor does. It's a piece of property owned by somebody and valuable because of how it can be used or because of its exchange value. It has economic value, but it has no intrinsic moral value in the eyes of the law. Now, Wise, of course, wants to change that. The whole purpose of this essay is to change the legal status of farm animals. And when we talk next time about this article, we'll look at Wise's argument. He thinks that the present treatment of farm animals is unjust, that the whole institution of factory farming is unjust, and that unjust institutions must be abolished. And therefore, we must abolish factory farming. We must get rid of it. Maybe some other kind of farming would be permissible, but not factory farming, where animals are treated like things. So back to the topic of rights. There has been a great deal written about whether animals have moral rights. Some people say yes, others deny it. Wise is pretty clearly in the camp of those who think that animals have moral rights. And because animals have moral rights, they ought to have legal rights. Let me say that again. Because animals have moral rights, they ought to have legal rights. What moral rights do animals have and why do they have them? That's a big philosophical issue. I think for Wise, it's fairly simple. What gives animals rights is primarily the fact that they are sentient. They are capable of suffering. And that's why Wise is opposed to factory farming, because of the amount of suffering that takes place in those institutions, and deprivation, which is a form of suffering. So animals, because they're sentient, have moral rights. Those moral rights can be violated. And when they are violated, an injustice occurs. Injustices must be rectified. The only way to rectify the injustice that is done to factory farmed animals is to abolish the factory farms altogether. So I've given you the gist of Wise's argument. We'll unpack it and lay it out formally on Tuesday next week. And by the way, until we start meeting live on the 1st of March, I will post my lectures on Tuesday and Thursday, probably. So both days next week, I'll post lectures on Tuesday and Thursday. And remember, I'm sorry. Next Thursday is our exam. So there won't be a lecture posted that day. So let me get it right here. Next Tuesday, I will post a lecture and we will conclude our discussion of Wise. The following Thursday, a week from today, you'll take your exam. The week after that, we'll be meeting both days, not physically in person, but I will be lecturing for both of those class periods, and I will post the lecture probably on Tuesday and Thursday. The following Tuesday is the 1st of March, and that's when we're going to go back in the classroom. Okay. So Wise thinks that animals have no legal rights, and one of the rights that they don't have is the right to sue others for mistreatment, for being harmed. And the reason for that is that there's a doctrine in the law called standing. Standing in the law says that unless your own interests are being adversely affected, you can't come into court and sue someone for infringing your rights or hindering your interests. You cannot sue in behalf of others. You have to sue because you yourself have been harmed or are threatened with harm in some way. Now, as you can see, that is going to keep animals out of court. Animals cannot represent themselves, and since they are not seen by the law as having any interests of their own, they can't even be represented by an attorney like Wise in court. So whenever Wise tries to break through this barrier, he gets rebuffed, and he's tried many times. He's tried to sue on behalf of orcas, which is a type of whale, I believe, orcas. They're used in places like Disney World or Sea World, and they're confined. They live their whole lives in confinement, and they're trained to entertain people. And Wise wants to get them released into the wild and back into the ocean to be with their own kind. So Wise has gone into court to try to represent orcas. He's tried to represent chimpanzees and bonobos who are being mistreated. And every time he does, he runs up against this doctrine of standing. And the other side, SeaWorld, for example, will reply to his lawsuit by saying the animal in question lacks standing. The law does not recognize animals as being able to sue, even to be represented by people like Wise. So Wise has tried to change that doctrine. He realizes that it's a barrier, and if he can get some court to recognize the standing of an animal, he will be through the door, and that will be an exciting moment for him, but it hasn't happened yet. Now, you may or may not know this, but corporations such as Microsoft and Tesla, IBM, Google, corporations are legal persons, and they therefore have rights under the law. Isn't it ironic that corporations, business corporations, have legal rights, but animals do not? Wise think that that's not only absurd, but thoroughly unjust. Corporations are not sentient. They're not even rational. They are legal fictions. They're legal constructs. They're legal creations created by the law. And the law gives them rights. Microsoft can sue others for violating its trademarks or copyrights or patents, for example. But an orca or a chimpanzee being mistreated cannot sue, cannot even be represented by people who want to sue in its behalf. So there's a certain irony to that, isn't there? Corporations are legal persons with legal rights. Animals are not. Wise is trying to change that. Okay, let me leave you with the following thought. John Stuart Mill, one of the great philosophers of all time, John Stuart Mill supposedly said the following somewhere. According to Tom Regan, in his book, The Case for Animal Rights, Tom Regan has an epigraph at the very beginning of the book. And here's what it says. Every great movement must experience 3 stages: ridicule, discussion, adoption. Now, I have online access to the collected works of John Stuart Mill. It's 30-some volumes, and every one of them is indexed. And also, because it's online, I was able to do a search. And a year or so ago, I was trying to find out, where did Mill say this exactly? And I couldn't find it. I don't know where Tom Regan got it. The collected works of John Stuart Mill supposedly contains everything he ever published. Every letter, every speech, every book, every article, every newspaper column, everything. And I scoured it thoroughly, and I can't find it. Tom Regan, unfortunately, is dead. He died a few years ago. I can't write him an email and ask him, where did you get this? I'm not accusing him of making it up. That would be unjust, unfair. but I don't know where Mill said this. So I'm going to take Tom Regan's word that Mill said this somewhere. Once again, every great movement must experience 3 stages: ridicule, discussion, adoption. Now, if it didn't get adopted, it would not be a great movement. So it stands to reason that if a movement is eventually adopted, it's going to be considered a great movement. Where are we in the movement to give animals legal status? Well, I think we're past the ridicule stage. Are people making fun of the idea? If you told someone that there's an attorney named Stephen Wise who's trying to get legal rights for animals, are you likely to get laughter? Probably not. I think people at least take the idea seriously that animals should have legal status. I think we're in the discussion stage. And Wise's article is evidence of that, isn't it? Law reviews and other journals are publishing articles in which the author argues that animals should have legal status or better legal status. So we're in the discussion stage. Whether we will ever get to the adoption stage remains to be seen. Wise certainly hopes we will, and he's devoted his life's work to this effort. Wise has devoted himself over the years to writing books and articles, representing animals in court, doing whatever he can to get the idea of animal legal rights accepted or adopted. But it's too early to tell. We're past the ridicule stage, we're in the discussion stage, and we don't know yet whether we'll ever get to the adoption stage. So here on page 203, final thought for the day, I promise. Here's a quotation from Wise, and this sets up his argument. He says, because farm animals suffer in great numbers, they make out a prima facie case both for moral and legal rights. So Wise is going to argue in the remainder of this essay that animals have moral rights and therefore should have legal rights. What is the basis for this claim of should have moral rights? The basis is sentience. A sentient being has a prima facie right to not have pain inflicted. And Wise thinks that that right is defeated in the case of factory farms by the fact that the way animals are treated on those farms is unnecessary and unjustifiable. So animals have a prima facie right not to be made to suffer, and there's no good reason that would justify that suffering. Therefore, according to Wise, animals have a moral right not to be made to suffer in the ways that they are made to suffer in factory farms. And since they have a moral right, they should have a legal right. And that means factory farms must be abolished because the rights of animals are being systematically violated. The whole institution of factory farming is unjust to the animals. And for that reason, the institution must be abolished. Not merely reformed or changed, but gotten rid of. Abolition is the goal. Okay, let me make a note in my notes. I'm going to pick up with anti-cruelty laws, and let's see how much we have to cover. As far as my notes go, we have most of page 5 of my notes to cover, all of page 6, and a little bit less than half of page 7. So I think it's reasonable for us to think we can get through the rest of the article on Tuesday. So have a great weekend. I'll send an email as soon as I get this uploaded to Canvas. Have a great weekend. Remember, don't show up at the classroom until the 1st of March. Until then, it'll be lectures like this. And don't forget your exam, 1 week from today, 8 o'clock to 9:20 in Canvas. When you go to Canvas and open up this course, this philosophy of law course, look for the word quizzes. It's on the left side. Quizzes, click it, and you'll see first examination. Then, don't click that until you're ready to start. But when you're ready to go and 8 o'clock arrives, click it and get started. And good luck when you take the exam. All right. See you next week on the screen.